Hello, everyone. Welcome to Many Minds Therapy Hub. It's been quite some time since our last recording. Um, so here we are, back with Rosie. Hi, Rosie.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm excited about this topic we have planned for today. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can hit the bell for notifications.
Yes, yes. And let
Yeah,
us know if there are any specific topics that you're interested in us to cover.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just feel free to drop any curiosities or anything you'd like us to explore in the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm also excited. Today we are going to be talking about internal family systems, or you'll hear us across this episode referred to as IFS.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's my passion model, I would say my favorite for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So Rosie, maybe you want to start kind of like I'll be asking you a lot of questions today because I know you really dig deep into this modality, and maybe start by just telling us what is IFS, what is internal family system in therapy.
Yeah, so IFS is a particular model of therapy that views the mind as having multiple parts. And basically, we have parts of us that develop to protect ourselves in the different like traumas and challenges that we experience in life, right? And those parts of us kind of stay with us and develop over time, right? Like if you think about like there are often these moments where we see like, okay, I'm having this reaction, I'm feeling really anxious about this, and I can see that there's like logically that what I'm anxious about doesn't make sense. Like, why am I freaking out about this, for example? And often there's, essentially like a protective part that's kind of feeling triggered or feeling like this urge to protect you in some way
Yeah,
to try to
yeah.
prevent or numb pain.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So parts is a big concept, and I really want to ask you more questions about that in IFS. But I'm curious before we move on to that, the self itself is a huge concept, and I don't know, the way I see it is also very essential to IFS. Can you
Yeah.
tell us maybe how it differs, like the self versus the parts when you work in IFS?
Yeah. So it's it's interesting because when you learn how to, in IFS they call it unblending, right? When you learn how to, when parts or learn how to separate, right? When we learn how
Hmm.
to take differentiate or like have space from parts where they can move back enough for us to be curious about them,
Hmm.
there naturally emerges like in IFS they call it the self with like a capital S, right? Which is your
Hmm.
truest self. And in DBT they call it the wise mind, right? It's
Hmm.
the truest essence of who we really are that
Yeah.
is fundamentally always there in all people, no matter how much trauma you have. It's just might be harder to access if your protective system is more kind of like rigidly in place because you've experienced more trauma or just had to protect yourself more in life.
So self would be the essence or true, with capital S, self, like that's who
Yeah.
we really are. And then we have these different parts that may actually be blocking at times that essence. Is that it? Did I put it in
Yeah,
simpler
yeah,
words?
yeah. An analogy that I've heard that I really like, right,
Mm-hmm.
is there's this the concept of like the self as a sun, right? And the sun
Mm-hmm.
is always there, and we might have parts that are like clouds, right, blocking the
Clouds.
sun where you can't see it, and it might be really cloudy and maybe even for a really long time, but it's always there.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's like they talk about Richard Schwartz talks about like the who created the model, right? It talks about the 8 C's of like what does self energy actually look like. I don't have those memorized, so I pulled them up, but it's like calmness, curiosity, clarity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, and connectedness. But there's a felt sense that like once you experience kind of
Mhm.
what it feels like to be in self energy, it's almost like a practice where you can become more aware intuitively when you're in self, or if there's like an anxiety, like
Mhm.
anxious part that's coming up, or a part that has an agenda. And
Mhm.
there are self-like parts, right? That are
Mhm.
might have like really beautiful agendas of healing, for example, but
Mhm.
there's if there's an agenda, that's not
Mhm.
self. Self is an energy of love and compassion, essentially. Like that's kind of the felt sense, is like a I experience it as like a
Mhm.
ground calm feeling, and like a compassion or like a warmth in my heart. But it
Yeah.
feels different for different people, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So maybe, yeah, I like that analogy with the sun and the clouds,
Mm,
actually,
yeah.
and the energy. So maybe talk to us about those different parts, like the different clouds that may actually be blocking that essence, that true self.
Yeah. Yeah. In IFS, they talk about like different types of parts, right? So there are
Mm-hmm.
manager parts that are like, usually I think of manager parts as like trying to prevent,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like the parts that are like an anxious part is often a manager, right? Where it's like trying to plan to prevent something bad happening, or trying to like, maybe manage or control like how somebody might be viewing you in a moment, or things like that. But they're parts that are trying to control the situation to keep you from experiencing pain, and or to keep you from kind of feeling pain from past wounds. And then there are
Yeah.
firefighter parts that
Mm-hmm.
are parts that are designed, like really are trying to help numb or take down the intensity of an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes that's it can be really extreme, and can be like either like addiction parts, or
Mm-hmm.
like non-suicidal self-injury can be like a way that people are trying to like take down the intensity of an emotion, right? But
So the manager is trying to help you manage so you don't feel. The firefighter is trying to take steps to, if you're already in a place where you're actually experiencing something, like fighting against that emotion, let's say, so you don't actually feel it.
yeah, and it can be either, like firefighters are often triggered by shame, like that's a big
Mm-hmm.
thing. But anything where you're either experiencing something in your life currently that's really intense on its own, or something is triggering like deeper past wounds, right?
Yeah.
And then there's underneath that there are exile parts, which are often inner child parts, right? I mean, I think often these parts develop in childhood,
Mm-hmm.
and have kind of like parentified inner child kind of energy to them, right? But their exile parts are the parts that carry the wounds of
Mm-hmm.
of the things that we've been through, or the messages that we've internalized about what it meant about us, what we went through.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, ultimately, like all of the parts are burdened,
Mm-hmm.
because they are taking on this intensity of either needing to protect us in some way, or like holding the wound. And the protective parts, the managers and the firefighters, are both trying to protect the exiles from feeling more pain, and also protect us from feeling the intensity of the emotions of the exile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the exile, I guess I'm trying to like put it together in other words. The exile would be something either internalized, because I've learned throughout my childhood or throughout life. So I have internalized the message, or an experience that, I'm trying to just like avoid in a way. Like it's just held there in place. And then you have this manager and firefighters protecting so they don't get to the exile. If I'm trying to think, how would I explain this to my child?
Yeah. It's like, I mean, I think if you think about, we all have memories that stick, right? Those memories that it's like, you think about that and there's still like a little zing or like to that, right? And often those are memories that, you know, like we talk about trauma being stored and like stuck, right? Like we're stuck in the past, and there's this exiles and other protective parts tend to get stuck in like these memories that showed us in some way that it wasn't safe to be fully ourselves or to be vulnerable in the world.
And those memories don't necessarily have to be conscious, right? They can be also unconscious memory. They could be also stuck in our body, not necessarily like thoughts that we may have looking back in time. So some of them we may not necessarily be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does IFS then help us kind of work through those, you know, memories, the stuckness, the exile, the managers, the firefighter? How do we heal through that, through this modality?
Well, in the beginning, it really is helping like parts to build protective parts to build relationships to the self, so that there's one, so that we can like unburden what they've taken on and not have to feel so alone in the load and the burden that they're carrying, right? Like, and it takes time. And I think often, you know, you can hear it like almost as reparenting, right? Like self-reparenting, where you and your truest, highest self, right, are showing up for these parts of yourself that are convinced that I have to protect myself in this way, or I'm not going to be loved, or I'm not going to be safe, or whatever it is, right? And that begins to lighten the load of and intensity of protectors, where they're able to trust the self to lead more, right? And parts never like go away, right? It's more like they get choice. Like if I don't have to carry this because this isn't true, what I've internalized, that I am not lovable because of XYZ, right? Then I get to choose. And maybe there might be parts of their role that a protector might enjoy, right? Like maybe this part really likes scheduling, right? Or maybe this really likes, you know, like making your space pretty or whatever. But if it's like, if the intensity of I have to do this in order to stay safe and loved is taken out of it, then there's more freedom and choice in that, and also greater harmony. And some of it too is also helping protective parts to build more compassion towards other parts, right? Like sometimes we get in these places where we're super polarized, where one part of me feels like I absolutely need to protect myself in this way, and another part feels like I have to protect myself in this completely opposite way, and they're at war. And that can be really painful, right? Like that kind of internal tug of war. And so being able to build harmony between parts, so there isn't like this kind of internal war happening, is another powerful thing. And then as over time, right, like as protectors learn to trust the self more, there's kind of more space to like actually unburden exiles, so that they're not carrying these deep wounds. But in the beginning, you really like want to be honoring the pace that
The
feels,
parts.
like you don't want to, I think oftentimes we'll have like a self like part that's like, let's heal, you know, like other parts might not be ready to dive in and really like unburden some of those deeper wounds.
So honoring their role, like they're there for a reason. They've learned to respond to the self or the experience or the memories or the exiles or the emotions in the way that they're doing it for a good reason. So maybe learning how to recognize those, honor their role until we're ready to trust the self.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of wisdom in protective parts, right? Like we don't protect ourselves in the ways we do for no reason, right? Like
Right.
there's people in our families or the world or our lives that have often like shown us over time and continue to show us that it's not easy to just show up fully authentic, right? There might be ways that self-protection makes a lot of sense. Right. Like the example that like comes to mind is like if you are in a family that's like really fat phobic, like being able to like navigate Thanksgiving, there might be protectors that have to like take you out of your body and not really let you be fully present in that moment, because that's a lot that can be really painful to be with if you're in a larger body, right? Or like there might be parts that are, you know, more sarcastic or whatever that like might help you by just kind of like turning the discomfort of the situation in a way that you can set a boundary in a way that doesn't feel vulnerable if you're not ready to feel vulnerable, or they're not ready to hear you from a vulnerable place.
Yeah. There is a function to that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are some techniques, some interventions maybe that you use in IFS?
Yeah. So I mean, I think one that I really like, right? If it kind of depends on where a client is. Like sometimes a client will come into a session and they have like one particular part that's really needing attention, right? And then we'll spend the session like really connecting and building relationship and understanding and compassion for that part and where it's coming from. Other times it might be like a whole jumble of parts, and even just they call it parts mapping, right? Where you're sorting like what parts are even coming up for me around this issue, and like how are they relating to each other? Are some parts allied, or some parts completely, you know, conflictual, or are they trying to protect a little exile in there, right? Like there's and that act of like making sense of like what is even coming up for me, and like and what are the kind of sides of this, right?
So
Help.
you kind of learn to recognize those then in therapy, like in a weekly session per se.
Yeah. And I think it can also be really grounding and help us to unblend, right? Like help us to get back into self energy, because when you're sorting through like what am I even feeling here, there might be parts that are kind of like I'm feeling really anxious, and then it's like really you're in that emotion, or I'm feeling really, you know, mad or whatever, right? And the act of like sorting through all of those parts and like mapping it out helps to get enough distance from that to show up in self with compassion for those protective parts. Yeah.
So how would someone, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and then sometimes if two parts are really polarized, like I will help them kind of listen the pretense, right? Like the prelude for parts feeling safe to do this, if they're really polarized, right, is like, okay, no one's winning the argument today. Like we just really want to hear. And I think often that gives us enough space to like really hear from both sides. Like, what are they hoping? How do they hope to protect you? And like, what are they afraid will happen if the other side wins, right? Yeah.
That's interesting. The idea of, okay, let's just hear what you have to say. Nobody's winning, because I guess that's what makes them exile, right?
Yeah, I mean, often like,
I mean, I'm sorry, that's what makes them polarized, not exile.
Yeah, that's what makes them polarized. Yeah, because there's this like gridlock of like, I can't let you win because of this really important role. Like for
what would be a
example,
simple example? Yeah, like what would,
like if you think about, okay, so an example that comes to mind, right, is if like somebody is really wanting to take a risk and put themselves out there around something in particular, there might be a part that's feeling some urgency around like, I need to take this risk, I might lose this opportunity, right? Like, and there might be another part that's like really afraid of maybe people's judgment, or how that might have gone poorly in the past, or like what might happen if you're vulnerable and feel rejected, right? So there can be like these very gridlocked parts, and sometimes there can be like vitriol between parts, right? It's like, I have to protect you in this way, or you're going to be destroyed, right? If I'm vulnerable and then rejected, then again, then I'm not going to be like, that will destroy me, right? And then there's like the part that's like really wanting to live a more like full free life. Yeah.
And that's usually when I tell people you can have all of these parts that actually can coexist. Because sometimes people can't really make sense of, how can I be afraid and at the same time feel so like brave and like want to do this, and then I pause myself because the fear of, you know, a past experience may actually show up. So those are those parts that are protective.
Yeah, and it can be really grounding to like really understand at a deeper level, like what are those different like sides of me, when one part of me is really feeling like this is the way to go about this situation, and another part of me is the opposite, right? And often there's almost, I think when parts are able to really like hear the other side without like feeling this defensiveness of like they're gonna win, right? That it can build greater like compassion, or it becomes less intense, right? And sometimes they have the same goal, right? Like sometimes they're really both trying to protect like your like one particular exile that formed from painful experiences of being rejected in that experience, or in that example, right? or what have you. But yeah. Or I guess like another example, right, is like if someone has disorganized attachment, there might be an avoidant part and like a anxious part, and they're both trying to protect like this little exile that's afraid of being rejected and abandoned, right? And it's like, and they're both trying to preserve the relationship, but they can be really painfully polarized.
And maybe this is actually a good segue to the question that I was going to ask you, is like, how do we then, because this is in therapy, right? How do we take this to our day-to-day life, and how would I start recognizing the different parts as I just live it, you know, live outside of the therapy room, and like what is their concern? Like, how do I know that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it can start as simply as like really like tuning into like, if you take some deep breaths and really like get like focus inward on like, what am I feeling right now? Like, or what am I noticing in my body, and get curious about that. Then even just like spending some time, I think especially in the beginning, like really journaling to try to like externalize like what is even happening in here, right? Like make sense of it. I think it can often really help to write it down on paper. And it, like in the parts mapping example, right? If you're just jotting down like what is coming up for me, what are the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, whatever sensations for me around this, and then just kind of getting curious around like, do these feel like distinct parts? But even just starting to get in touch with like, what are the things that are coming up for me, without needing to know like, well, this part is feeling this way and thinking this and blah blah blah, right? Like it doesn't have to start in that way. And I think over time, especially if you're working with an IFS therapist, you do start to build an understanding of like, what are your kind of main parts that come up.
So here, slowing down,
Yeah.
tuning into yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. and checking in to recognize what is actually going on.
Yeah.
Until you kind of like start building some more understanding through the work that you do in therapy with an IFS therapist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
power of slowing down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think my IFS level 1 trainer, one of them said like slow is fast, right? And
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
we often have, like I said, like these parts that are like, let's heal, and like have
Mm-hmm.
like want to get there quickly, but just learning to like slow down and have compassion for yourself and like your protective parts, like that in and
Mm-hmm.
of itself is huge, because often
Yeah.
we're like judging ourselves for feeling this way, right, or whatever, and that just makes it more painful.
Yeah. 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 For sure.
Yeah.
So what are some of the challenges that you've seen people face, when they've said, okay, I'm going to take this step, I'm going to start my work with someone who practices IFS?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there can be stigma that comes up for people around the idea of like us having like a multiplicity of the mind, right? Like multiple
Mm-hmm.
parts. Like, what does that mean about me? Do I have dissociative identity disorder, and might have like some
Mm-hmm.
internalized judgment or stigma around that?
Right.
And so I think like working through that can be a bit like, can take some time for people, and also
Mm-hmm.
just like really showing up for like this, what is that part of you that is really worried about what that means, if you have parts,
Mm-hmm.
or like really worried about maybe like being insane, right, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right, like whatever mental health stigma you've internalized. And I mean, this is not a new concept. Like this has been around, Carl Jung talked about the idea of the multiplicity of the mind, or like us having multiple parts. It's a very old concept, I'm sure way before him. But and then also, I mentioned it before, right? But it can take a lot longer if you've had significant trauma, especially early childhood trauma, or have had to protect yourself a lot
Yeah.
in life, to even learn how to unblend. Like it can take
Mm-hmm.
a long time to even access self, right? And if
Yeah.
you're somebody that is already like practicing mindfulness or meditating or whatever, like you might have already touched in with that, or like have a sense of
Mm-hmm.
how to connect in with that for yourself. And
Yeah.
we're not, right? Like I think it can, and having the patience, right, when a part might feel like an urgency around, like I have to heal now because I'm, watching
Mm-hmm.
the damage of how I'm protecting myself, and I can't, like I need to get out of that. And so being able to like have patience with yourself, and however long it takes, right,
Yeah.
to,
And some compassion too, right?
yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it is difficult. I mean, that actually is answering another one of the questions that a lot of people have, and I was going to ask you with IFS or a lot of the other modalities, like how long does it take? We don't really know. It really depends on your own history. And you're
Yeah,
saying, along with that history, we really have to be kind to ourselves, have some compassion, because there is a part of you that may actually show up saying, I really have to heal. Because now I'm learning about like all of these ways that I'm hurting myself.
yeah, yeah. I think that as far as like how long does it take, that's such an
Mm-hmm.
individual thing.
Mm-hmm.
For some people it's like they've already done a lot of work before kind of coming to
Mm-hmm.
be with me, or some other IFS therapist, right, and they're like
Mm-hmm.
already can access self easily, and then that can be
Yeah.
a quicker process, or if they have less trauma, right? But if you have,
Mm-hmm.
I think the more trauma that you have and the harder it is for you to access self, like the more time it can take. But also, I mean, if you are intentionally taking time between sessions to like connect with parts that you've
Mhm.
maybe like started to get to know in sessions, then that can really, really speed up the process too.
Yeah.
Because
So
they're,
like if you're not just working through this in therapy, but you're also intentionally, consciously doing the work outside.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think the more that you're putting into building relationships with
Hmm.
protected parts, the more that they trust you to lead, and
Yeah.
the quicker that can move.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why did you choose IFS? I guess I'm curious, how does it compare to other modalities? And yeah, why IFS? I know you're very passionate about it.
Yeah. Well, I think to be transparent, in my 20s, I worked with a therapist that
Hmm.
did inner child work. And
Hmm.
so when I heard about IFS in grad school, it immediately resonated for me because I got
Hmm.
so much out of my work with that therapist, right? And
Hmm.
I saw like how aligned they were. I think this is a bit more nuanced and like complex, but it really resonated with me. And um yeah, I think it's a lot more it's not skills building, right? Like this isn't
Right.
CBT where
It's a
you're counting
process. Hmm.
dots or like learning how to see that you're in black and white thinking. It's a lot deeper because you're really coming from um a a deeper psychic place, right? Where you're kind of going into these deeper wounds or these deeper kind of memories or ways of protecting yourself that have developed maybe when you were a kid a lot of the time, right? So
Yeah.
it's a lot I don't know how to describe it exactly. I think when I first heard about it, I thought it was like you're gonna like think up these parts and it'll be like a metaphor and it'll be poetic, but it really is like slowing down and getting curious about what's actually there. Like it isn't, you're not
Hmm.
making it up. It's really like fascinating the more that you learn how to like connect with parts, how they really do have their own story and their own kind of wisdom. And some of my parts are quite sassy and like others are really like sensitive or super creative or whatever, but they definitely like all have their own kind of natural way of being that I'm not like making it up. uh,
Hmm.
yeah, and I also use EMDR with IFS, which I think
Hmm.
can be really beautiful. I think they work really well together, especially if like a part is really feeling stuck around something, then that can be
Hmm.
a beautiful way. Or like
To help the move, give it some movement and
yeah.
understanding.
And a lot of the times when protectors are kind of caught in the stance of like verbal sparring or like defensive poses where it's like they're
Hmm.
like even the idea of like building compassion for another part, if they feel like that part's like really harming them, can feel threatening. And so it takes that out of it because um it allows whatever is coming up for that part or that like or maybe multiple parts to just be there without needing to kind of like
Hmm.
sort through or like build compassion, right? Like there you might not
Hmm.
be there yet, right? So
Yeah.
but I think um yeah, I think it's different from other models because it's a lot more like emotionally focused, a lot more focused on the body.
Hmm.
And you're really like trying to listen to kind of what's coming up for you instead of trying to figure it out or coming at it from a cognitive angle where you're like trying
Hmm.
to put thoughts on trial or whatever, right? Like the
Well, I hear it slowing down, recognizing, honoring those, hearing what they have to say instead of like managing them.
Yeah.
Because now you're managing a manager, right? And that's what I
Right. Yeah.
hear. Or managing a fighter rather than, what do you have to say to me? What is your role? Why are you here? You know, what's getting in the way of you allowing me to just be my true self?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Or
And there's,
maybe I do need you to be there for a reason right now, you know? And I guess that's what you meant when you, for me, this is the way I take it, when you said build a relationship with your true self. Sometimes we do need these parts. We don't want to just like get rid of them.
yeah.
They're there for a reason. And maybe if I'm aligned, my true self is saying, okay, I really do need this right now, because like you put the example, I'm in this family dinner and right now my true self needs some of these managers to help me out through these 5 hours.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I'm doing it from in a different way rather than in a more defensive way.
Right. Yeah. It's
Okay.
almost like an
Mm-hmm.
intentional, mindful,
Mm-hmm.
it's like holding,
Decision.
supporting protectors in doing what they're good at. Right. Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
different energy. Or I mean, you think about like, say you're on trial, for example, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like there might be parts that are like really good at arguing, right? That it's like being able to emotionally support those parts while
Mm-hmm.
they're showing up in a way that feels choiceful instead of like life or death, right? It just
Mm-hmm.
feels completely different. And it takes also like, I don't know, like you hear about client resistance, right? And there is
Mm-hmm.
no resistance in IFS. Like that's not a thing. It's if you as a therapist are experiencing a client as resistant, you're in a protective part yourself, right? Like there isn't.
Mm-hmm. So you also, as a therapist, would have to look into your parts when you're doing this work, which is beautiful, right? Because now you have to be mindful of yourself and how you are showing up with your client.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to be a good self, or not good self, true self, or allowing your own managers to have that relationship with yourself to
Yeah.
then do the work with your client, or at least
Yeah.
understand why that part is showing up for you in that moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it is definitely a model that like forces me to keep healing, right? I'm not like, there are
Mm-hmm.
some sessions where like I can't quite get that manager to step back, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
that part is really like struggling with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also I was talking about like skills building, right? Like sometimes that's really comforting for managers. Here's a list of tools that you can use to help like get the whole system back into kind of a place of like feeling grounded in yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that feels really different than like let's fix you. You know, like, which is I think
Yeah.
often
Yeah.
how it can feel. Um
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is wonderful, Rosie. I know we're running out of time. And thank you. I really wanted to do this episode with you in IFS because I feel like I know we had done one before for one of my classes that I was teaching, and it was fascinating. So I wanted to get this one out for people that actually needed more understanding of IFS
Yeah.
and the work you do with it and how it
Yeah.
helps.
Thank you for taking the time with me on this. And I think that there's a lot to, I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, this is more like a basic 101 type of
Yeah. Yeah.
few minutes. There is a lot more to it, but at least we get like people get the gist of what is IFS, especially if they see it on a website, if they see people talking about it, but they don't really have a, an overview of what it is and how it may look like.
Yeah. And if people have any particular curiosities
Mm-hmm.
about it, like we said before, please feel free to drop it in the comments and maybe we'll
Yeah,
different.
we'll cover it for sure. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in another episode.
Thanks everyone. Bye.